Hi guys, welcome to the video. In this video, I will explain and demo all the features of CSS Grid so that you can start using it in your next project. So let's get started. I got a simple project here. This I have a HTML file which contains wrapper div, which will be our grid container, and a CSS file which has code for adding background color for our grid container and the child divs. That's about it. This is very simple to create, but if you need, I have a link in the description for the repo. First, let's understand why we need CSS Grid. Let's say we want to build something like this, and when the content in the first box increases in this direction, the entire column size should increase, and the same goes for the row. So this is very hard to achieve with the conventional method and also Flexbox. This is where the CSS Grid comes in for the rescue and allows us to define these columns and rows which will automatically align even if the content in one of these boxes increases. We can create our grid container using display grid or inline grid. I'm using grid here, and we can define the numbers of columns and rows we want using these two properties. Here FR is a new unit that is introduced as part of the grid specification, which means a fraction of grid container size. Let me explain. Let's say we have a grid container size of 300 pixel. So what this defines is we are assigning 1/3 of the total size of grid container to each of this column. So that will end up being 100 pixel, 100 pixel, and 100 pixel. Let's take another example. Let's say we have defined 2 FR and 3 FR and 1 FR, and the grid size is still 300 pixel. So now we will assign 2/6, 3/6 and 1/6 to each of these columns, which will end up to 100 pixel, 150 pixel and 50 pixel. Since this size depends on the container's size, whenever the container size increases or decreases, the column size increases with it. And also you can use the absolute size like 200 pixel or EM, REM. Now let's understand the basic terminologies in our CSS grid. These boxes here are called as grid cells. We have like 6 grid cells, and the direct children of our grid containers are called as grid items. As of now, each of these grid items are sitting inside one grid cell, but this might not be the case, and one of this grid item can occupy more than one grid cell. In this case, it's called as a grid area. So the first grid item might be occupying more like 4 grid cells. This I will explain in a bit. Next, let me highlight the grid lines here. These lines here are called as grid lines, and we have 1, 2, 3 and 4 grid lines in this axis, and 1, 2, 3 grid lines in this axis. This will be useful because we will be able to place our grid items with the help of these grid lines, which I will explain in the future. Next, the space between these two grid lines are called as grid tracks, and we have 1, 2, 3 grid tracks in this axis and 1, 2 grid tracks in this axis. This will essentially form our columns and rows where we will place our content. And finally, we have gutter, which is an alley between two grid cells, and we have a property called as column gap, which will apply the gap, the gutter between the columns. Let me remove the grid lines here. So as you can see, the gutter is between the columns. Next, we have one more property called as row gap, which will apply the gutter between the rows. And finally, we have a shorthand called as gap, which will apply both of this column gap and row gap. One thing to notice here is uh, the gutters are applied between the grid cells, and they are not applied around the grid container. Here there is no grid gutter, so it's only applied between the grid cells. Now let's get back to these properties. As I explained before, we can use absolute sizing or FR unit for this properties, but also we can use a combination of absolute size and FR unit like this. So here the first column is given an absolute size of 300 pixel, and the remaining space is divided between these two columns. And also we can use repeat annotation. So this is equivalent to writing 1FR, 1FR and 1FR. So this will help in defining large grids. Also we can write something like this, which will divide into two columns. In there the first column will get the 2FR space, fraction of the whole column here. Yeah, so we can define something like this. Now let's understand what is explicit and implicit grids. If we define the columns and rows that we want explicitly using these properties, then they are called as explicit grid. If we don't define the numbers of rows we want, then the rows will be automatically created, and this is called as an implicit grid. Here we can control our implicit grid size using a property called as grid auto rows. I mean, if you have not mentioned the rows, it will be grid auto rows, and it will be grid auto columns for columns if you have not mentioned the column. So here we can mention the absolute size, and also if your grid items will have more content like this, the content will be hidden because we have mentioned the absolute size. But also you can use a annotation called as min max, which will specify the minimum size, which is 200 pixel, and you can also specify the maximum size, which currently I have given it as auto. So this means the grid's size will be expanded based on the content inside the grid items. Yeah, that's all for the explicit and implicit grid. Now let's check out line-based placement in CSS Grid. Let's say we have defined a grid like this. So we have defined a 3x3 grid, and we have less item. So you can see this grid because I have highlighted that in the inspect mode. Next, let's say we want to make our grid item 1 to occupy a space from here till here. So this is where we used line-based placement. So that can be done using a property like this. So as you can see, it's occupying the whole space here. Let's define for other grid items as well. And also you can see here, so since I have defined this property for item 1, it's occupying this space, but I have not defined for others. I have not still saved it, so that will be auto placed. So as you can see, it's occupying the space here. Let me highlight the grid again. Okay, now let's check out what's happening with these properties. So here let me highlight the grid lines, number the grid lines, sorry. So what this property defines is we should start our grid item in column number 1, which is here, and end at column number 2. And next we should start with row number 1, which is here, and end with row number 4. So that's why it's occupying this whole space. It's the same for item 2. So we should start with column number 3 and end with column number 4, and row number 1 and row number 4. So that's why it's occupying the space here. This is how you place our grid items using line-based placement. The same goes for item number 3 and item number 4. So one more thing here to remember is, if it's spanning only one grid cell, which is true in this case, we don't need to define this property, so we can just leave it, so that will be automatically taken. So Yeah, and this is a lot of code here, so we can reduce the lines, the number of lines here using a shorthand. So that would look something like this. So here grid column is a shorthand for both of grid column start and grid column end, and we are defining both of them here. So this is 1 and 2. As you can see, the grid items are occupying the same space as before. And also, as I explained before, we can just remove the grid column end if it's just spanning one grid cell. As I explained before, this is only spanning one grid cell, so this can be taken one step ahead like this. So I have removed the grid column end, which will be taken automatically. So here these lines of code can be further reduced using a property called as grid area, which is a shorthand for grid column and grid row, like this. So now let me explain the order in which these numbers are used. So the first number is used as row start number, the second one is used as column start, the third one is used as row end, and the fourth one is used as column end. So this is in anti-clock direction, so this is not in line with the CSS, which is mostly clockwise. So this is one thing that we need to remember. So it's anti-clockwise. We start with the row start, column start, row end, and column end. Now let's check out counting backwards. So as you know, these grid lines for grid are numbered as 1, 1, 2, 3, 4. So and same way in this column direction. So they are also given negative numbers in the opposite direction. So the whole thing, we were using positive numbers here, so the whole thing can be written using the negative numbers. That means counting backwards, like this. Let me explain. So as I said, these are given negative numbers like this. One thing to note here is this will start at the explicit grid. So if you have defined one more grid item and is occupying, it has created one more track here, that is called as an implicit grid. So the numbering backward, this negative number will still start here. That's one thing to keep in mind using this. Everything else will be same as we were using the positive when we were using the positive number. So it's like you can see we start with a column start, which is here, and grid column end is here, and row start is here, and row end is here. So this grid item will occupy this whole space. Now let's check out how we can use span keyword in these properties. So as you can see, this is same as before. We are defining the start and column start and the row start. For the end here, and this is ending in just one grid track, this is occupying one grid track, so we don't need to define the end. But here instead of giving the actual grid number, you can use span to specify how many grid tracks this item should span. So we are starting here, which is row 1, and then we need to span 3 grid tracks according to this. So this is how we can use span to specify how many grid tracks our grid item should span for, instead of specifying the actual grid line number. Now let's check out grid template area. So till now we have used the grid line number to define where our grid item sits on our grid. So there is another approach using grid template area. So we can define where our grid items sits. We can do that by giving names to our grid area like this. So I have defined a general structure of the page. Let me change it here also. And next we are using a property called as grid area to define the name of our grid item here. So we have already used this property to as a shorthand for grid column and grid row. Now we are defining the name of the area. Then once we define the name here, then we can use a property called as grid template area to define where this grid items define sits in our grid like this. So as you can see, this is nicely formatted, and we have defined a grid of 9 columns. You can see clearly here. So we have used spaces here to like correctly format to match what's gonna like the finished to match the finished grid, but you can also remove these spaces here. So this is very straightforward. So we are just defining which grid area should be grid item should occupy this grid cell. So we have defined HD as a grid area name, and we are using this HD here, so that this means this grid cell will be occupied by HD, and this will be occupied by SD. So this is how this is how we can use this property to place our grid items. We can also use dots to leave some of the grid cell empty like this. So these grid cells are left empty. Yeah, so and still maintain the format as it is, so that we can understand what's going on. Now let's look at another example, the media query, to understand this property even more. So I'm using the mobile first approach here, and defining one column in mobile, and making this grid areas occupy the full width like this. Next we define the layout for screen more than 500 and 700 pixel. So as you can see here, now we define the header to occupy the full space, and the sidebar to occupy 3 grid cells, and we have defined a grid of like 9 cells as before, and we are not overwriting that grid here for screen more than 700 pixel, but we are changing a little bit here. So we are moving the footer above in this row. So if we increase the size, you can see the change. Now the footer is sitting with the content and sidebar. Yep, that's about it for the grid template area. Next, let's take a look at named grid lines. So as you have seen, you can place our grid items on the grid using the line numbers, but also you can assign them grid names like this. So we are using the same property that we used before to define the column and rows, numbers of columns and rows that we wanted. That is grid template column. Let me explain what's happening in this property. So what we are defining is, we are defining this column name as main start. We are defining a column of 1 FR. Next, same with the row. So we are defining the row, the first row as main start. So this is what this property is defining. So it's naming all our grid lines. Next, we can use these grid names to place our grid items. Before we were using the numbers, line numbers. Now we are using the grid names. As before, we start with the column start, which is this one, so the main start, you're starting here, and coming, as I explained before, if it's spanning only one grid track, we don't need to specify the column end, so we can just skip it, it will automatically taken. And next is grid row start. We are going to start at main start, and we are going to end at main end. So that's how this is occupying the whole space here. Yeah, that's about it for naming of the grid lines. Also here you can define more than one names for the grid lines, so it should be separated by commas. Now let's check out the implicit grid area that is created by this grid line names actually. So if we define the grid line names as content start, and if we append the start and end to our grid line names, then it will create a space for our grid area. So let me show you what I mean. So as you can see here, we had content start here and content end here, and the same goes here. And the same goes here, content start and content end. So as we have just defined the grid area, we have not defined, we have not placed that item using grid template area as before, but it is assigned this grid cell, this because of this declaration. So the reverse of this is also true. So what I mean by this is, so if we have defined grid area, it will automatically create our named grid lines. So let me explain with an example. This is an example we saw before. So this defines a grid of 9 columns, and we are defining the grid areas here, and we are also defining where this grid item should sit in the grid. Okay, next let's understand what's happening here. So as I explained, these grid areas will create their own named grid lines. So this overlay is starting with the main start, which is at here. The content is defined as main, so our grid line will be here, main start, and will end with the main end. So the content will be the content is defined as main, so it will end here. And again, grid row head hd start and ft end. So this is defined as hd, so our start will be here, and our ft end will be here. So when I say this will define named grid lines means, so if we have this as hd, then this will become hd start, and this line will become hd end. So that names are defined by this grid area. Now let's understand the box alignment in the CSS grid. The CSS grid implements box alignment specifications level 3, which is also implemented by Flexbox. So most of the properties that we find in Flexbox are also there in CSS grid. CSS grid has reused all these properties, and also it has provided its own implementations for certain of the properties. So in to go further, we need to understand the two axes of CSS grid, which is inline axis. This is called, by default, the directions of the inline axis is like this, and the block axis. So this might not be the case all the time. So in the future chapter, I will show you how we can change these directions of these axes. But for the most part, this would be the case. So this direction would be inline axis, and this will be block axis. The alignments in the CSS grid is based on these two axes. So let's check out the alignment in the block axis first. So this axis. So for this we use two properties called as align items and align self. Align items is a property that we can use on the CSS grid to specify the global alignment for all the CSS, all the grid items. So we can use property, values like start, end, and center. So what this means is, since this axis is starting from this direction, so this will be the start, this will be the end, and this is center. The same goes for the next grid cell. So as you see in most of the example till now, the grid item used to like occupy the whole space here. So this is one grid cell. So it used to occupy the whole space. That's because the default for this grid items is stretch. So that's why the grid items used to occupy the whole space that is there in the grid cell. Next, now if we specify the grid items, alignment as start, it will align from the beginning, that means start, and it will take only the space that is needed by its content. So if the content has like less if the grid item has less content, it will occupy less space. So I mean to say it is based on the content in the grid item. Okay, now let's check out align self. So as I said before, so we can override global alignment using align self. So here for item 1 I have just left it blank. I'm not assigned anything, so it's following the global start alignment. And next for item 2 I have specified as start, which is same as global, so it has not changed the position. And for item 3 it's end. So as I just explained in the block axis, so this is gonna start here and end here. So this is the end, so the item is aligned to the end. And for item 4, same explanation goes, and it's aligned at the center of the grid cell. So we need to remember this is our grid cell, and it's aligning inside the grid cell based on the axis. One thing to remember is this will be align self will be default. I mean the default value for align self will be stretched for all the grid items except for those that have aspect ratio. So I'm talking about elements like images which have aspect ratios. In that case, the align self will be set to start. That's because if we set that to stretch and the image has aspect ratio, it will be distorted if it's stretched. That's the reason. But for all other grid items, it will be stretched. That means it will occupy the whole grid cell. Yeah, that's all for the alignment of grid items in the block axis. Now let's check out the alignment in the inline axis. With the inline axis, it's called as justifying the items. So we have two properties, justifying items and justify self. Same as before, justifying items is used on the grid container to specify the global alignment in the inline axis. So this is our inline axis. Okay, so again justify self can be used to override this global alignment. So for item 1 we have left it we have not defined anything, but in item 1, since there is more content, it's occupying the whole grid cell. Otherwise it would have aligned from here. So as I explained before, this is the direction of our inline axis. So the start inside our grid cell will be this one and end will be this one. Okay, so for the item 3 we have given as justify self as end. So as you can see, the item 3 is aligned to the end of the grid cell. And for item 4 we have specified it as center, so it is aligned with the center of the grid cell. And also we can use this in combinations with the align self that we just learned before. So I have used align self here with the justify self. So align self is for block axis, as I mentioned before. So the block axis direction is like this, the default one. So the center is here, so it's aligned to the center, and inline axis start is here, so it's aligned here. One thing to remember here is if there is more content, it's gonna occupy the whole space. I mean the space needed for the content. If there is less content, this is the alignment that it's gonna follow. Now let's say we have a scenario where grid tracks are occupying less space than our grid container. This happens when we have defined fixed size of grid container like this using height and width, and we have also fixed the column size using grid template rows and row columns as 100 pixel. That's why these grid tracks are occupying less space than the grid container here. So I have already explained this property. So we are defining the grid area here, and using this grid area name we are placing the grid items. We are picking which grid cell it should occupy. Now in this case we can use two properties to align these grid tracks in our grid container. They're called as align content, which is in block axis, and justify content, which is in line axis. So align content, for align content you can use the same properties as before, like start, end, space between, space around. So I've used the space, I've used align content, I've used start property here, and as you know, the block axis is in this direction, so it's starting from here. So same, if we use space around and switch off this, we have 3 tracks in the block axis, that means in this direction, as defined by here. Align content as defined as space between, so we have a space between each of these tracks. So that's why we are seeing a space here, but this space is occupied by the item 1 because it's supposed to occupy these 2 grid cells. If there is a space in between, it's gonna like occupy the space. Next we have a property called as justify content, which will align the grid tracks in the inline axis. Same as before, this has many values. I have just used the center here. So as you know, this is the inline axis default direction, so and the center will be around here, so that's why this grid tracks has is positioned like this. So as you can see in all the examples that I explained here, for the alignment we are using values as start and end instead of the conventional CSS properties, physical properties like top, right, left, and bottom. That's because if we have an inline axis like this, and we, for the alignment, if we use left and right, this is this is left and this is right, but if the inline axis changes direction like this, then the left and right doesn't make any sense here in this direction, but the start and the end still makes sense. It's same as before, start and end, same as in this direction. So that's why we are not using those physical attributes in in aligning these items in the grid. Now let's check out writing mode in CSS Grid. So in most of the languages we see now, they are mostly Latin based. That means this is how it's written. So the words are written in this direction and the paragraphs are written in this direction. This is called as the inline axis, and this is called as the block axis. So this might not be the case in all the languages. Let's say in Arabic, so the words are written in this direction and the paragraph still follows this direction. So inline axis and the block axis. And in Han based system, the words are written in this direction and the paragraphs follows this direction. In that case, this will be the inline axis and the block axis. So this I discussed just now, so when explaining alignment. So this is how we can change the writing mode in our CSS Grid. So the default is horizontal TB, that is top to bottom. That is most common in all the languages we use right now, and we can specify the direction, which is left to right here. This is also default. Now we can change this. So as you can see, the direction has been changed here from right to left, left to right, to right to left. So this is the direction that the Arabic languages follows. Next, for Han based system, so as I explained, so the inline axis is in this direction. That means the words are written in this directions, and the block axis is in this direction. So the alignment the alignments properties that we wrote, it's still good. That means we don't need to do anything about it, because we are using logical values instead of the physical attributes like top, left, and right and bottom. We're just using start and end, so it will work fine with this if we change the writing mode also. That's all about the CSS grid. Thanks for watching. If you like the video, please consider subscribing, and also check out my other videos on the screen.